Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. This is Filippo Veglio, representing the WBCSD team. Very warm welcome to this virtual session on key trends and disruptions for the decade ahead. We hope you're all healthy and safe in the midst of this crisis, of course, and we hope the same applies to your loved ones, your colleagues, your partners all across the world. As I mentioned, the session today will focus on the decade ahead, 2020 to 2030. What are the key trends and disruptions that we have been analyzing and that we would like to share perspectives on today? I see several people joining still at this moment, so I'll take a few more seconds of context. I'm happy to be your host today. I am with the WBCSD team and I'm responsible for the People program, which includes the work around Vision 2050, which we'll present briefly, as well as all of the outreach functions. A pleasure to have you all on the call today. The call of today, the event of today, part of our series of virtual events, which we have set up given the crisis and given the restrictions around face-to-face meetings. WBCSD has embarked on sort of a reframing of its engagement of members, partners, and other stakeholders. This is today's session of a wider set of events laid out for the next 4 months, so April, May, June, and July, with 2 featured sessions taking place each Monday and Wednesday over the coming weeks. And hoping and determining the team to provide you with inspiration, with expertise, with insights, but of course also with exchange opportunities across our community. These featured sessions are complemented by in-depth working group sessions. All of this information you can find on the link that you see on this particular slide, and please do not hesitate to visit the various opportunities, to explore the various opportunities that you have to join. Allow me also as the host today to lay out a few housekeeping, well, let's call them rules or ideas. First of all, the idea that the meeting is being recorded. Not everybody can join across a busy period for many across their agendas, but the meeting is being recorded, and the slides as well as the recording will be made available the following day, so tomorrow, the 28th of April, to anyone interested, of course also to the participants of this call. We take the liberty of muting participants, and we would like to ask everybody, except of course the speakers of today's session, I'll get to that list. We ask everybody to please switch the video function off, so as to save some bandwidth. You never know nowadays with the many calls taking place and the bandwidth taken up. Last but not least, the easiest way to engage in this call in terms of questions or comments is via the chat function, which you should easily find on your screen, depending on the devices, but it's you can easily access that chat function as laid out in the instructions here. So please do not hesitate to reach out via the chat function. I will make sure to forward and to position those questions for the speakers in this particular session. Before getting started and diving really into the agenda for the day, also another traditional housekeeping item of WBCSD, which is the antitrust statement reminder. Please, if we could call upon all of you to refrain in any discussion or conversation in this particular session, to refrain from addressing any competitively sensitive issues, such as the ones you see outlined here: pricing and costs, bid strategies, capacity additions or reductions, customer issues, and of course also any output decisions. Thank you very much for adhering to these housekeeping issues so that the call and the session can run as smoothly as possible. Today's agenda easily laid out in 3 parts around these key trends and disruptions for the decade ahead. I will kick off with a little bit of context, including some organizational context, as these sessions are also open to non-WBCSD members and partners. We have tried to be as open as possible in opening up the session, so I'll just spend a few short minutes on that. We will then dive in with Julian Hill-Landolt and three of our member representatives into the key trends and disruptions for the decade ahead. And we very much look forward in particular, of course, to the insights, not only of the research, but also the comments from our member companies. And after that, we will be wrapping up the session, for which we have allocated a maximum of 90 minutes. So we will see how far we get in that allocated time. Allow me just a very few brief introductory slides with regard to WBCSD. WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, an association regrouping 200 forward-looking companies from about 20 industry sectors and 40 countries if you take their headquarters, united around the idea of leadership, business leadership for a sustainable future, as you see outlined here, and the sustainable future being defined as a world in which 9+ billion people are living well and within the boundaries of the planet by the middle of this century. We'll come back to that overall vision, given that it's closely related to today's topic. A very warm welcome to our members, representatives on this session this morning in terms of Geneva time. Thank you very much for your trust and ongoing support. A very warm welcome to all of you across the membership. I'm very glad to have you as part of this call, and of course as part of the wider organizational efforts to advance the business sustainability agenda. A very warm welcome, of course, also to our global network partners and other institutional partners who could make themselves available for today's call. Equally briefly, the WBCSD's work program is regrouped around what we call 6 programs linked to 6 particular system transformations, ranging from the circularity agenda to the urban infrastructure agenda, to climate and energy, of course, to the food and nature agenda, to people issues, and last but not least, to what we call redefining value, the measurement, valuation, and disclosure of companies' performance, and the linkage it has to driving a more sustainable form of capitalism. For anyone interested in WBCSD's work, all of the information is available on our website, and you can dive into the particular areas depending on your interest. The context of today's session, as you see outlined here, is what in WBCSD we call Vision 2050, what I alluded to in an earlier slide, the vision of a world in which 9+ billion people live well within the boundaries of the planet. This vision was launched slightly over a decade ago, and we are in the process, alongside the 40 companies that you see pictured here through their logos, we are in the process of refreshing this particular vision. This is an 18-month exercise. It is ongoing and due to be finalized at the end of 2020. And in essence, we're looking at, as we can read here, as laying out the routes to what is an achievable, sustainable future that companies are excited and energized to work towards. And at the same time, also looking at the decade ahead, in particular, at making the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, directly actionable, with underpinning it through a system transformation approach. A lot of information is also available on the web, and we'll come back on a number of links where you can find more information on Vision 2050, but it's important to underline that this is a particular context for today's call. And the second slide I want to show you about Vision 2050 before diving really into the trends is where does today's call really sit? Today's call sits around one of the 5 work streams that these 40 members and the WBCSD team are tackling alongside a number of experts and reviewers. We're looking at system transformation in terms of understanding better how transformation happens along major economic systems. We're zooming in on the update of the pathways between today and 2030. How do the next 3 decades look, and where do we want to go, and what does business have to do to get us there? We're looking in particular at the operating environment of the decade ahead. What are the issues that businesses need to navigate over the next decade, and we'll go right into it after this slide. We're also zooming in around the so-called enablers and barriers to this transformation of economic systems. What is the latest thinking on this, and how can things get done around it? And last but not least, how do we also across this global process gather voices, gather inputs, and gather perspectives from all across the world, from companies and other stakeholders, on what works or what doesn't in particular geographies and sectors. So part of a wider roadshow of engagement across the 18 months to gather as many inputs as possible. So with that said, we are heading to the second part of the call, which is really zooming in on this particular area of the decade ahead in terms of the trends and the disruptions, with insights from these particular speakers. We have Julian Hill-Landolt, who is the director of the Vision 2050 Refresh project in WBCSD. He'll go into the depths of the research of what we have come up so far in terms of why we're doing this and what have we come up with in terms of key issues. And then we'll have the pleasure of having David Hone, Anne Gadegaard, and Duncan Pollard, representing Shell, Novo Nordisk, and Nestle, respectively, who will provide their perspectives around the presentation of these trends and disruptions. Will react, if you will, to Julian's positioning of these trends and disruptions. So with that said, I take the liberty now of handing over to my colleague Julian Hill-Landolt, who will take us through a number of slides outlining these trends and disruptions, and then I will take it back to solicit the inputs from our member representatives. So Julian, over to you, and please don't forget, for all of those participating, I see 60 plus people have so far signed up, to use the chat function to address any issues or clarifications, and we'll take them along the way. Julian, over to you for the next part of this session.
Thank you very much, Filippo. So good morning, good afternoon to those of you east of Geneva. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to do my very best to give you a quick overview of the work that we've been doing, looking at the decade ahead, to place it in the context of the original Vision 2050 and also the work that we're doing on the refresh of Vision 2050, and I'll try and get through as much of it as I can within about 30 minutes before passing over to our speakers. But inevitably, this is a summarized version, and there are documents being made available publicly in the coming weeks, which will cover all of this in detail. So Vision 2050, I hope that many of you will recognize this pathway on the screen. It's best known for that pathway towards a vision in which 9+ billion people can live well within planetary boundaries. It laid out must-have transitions that need to take place during a period which it termed the turbulent teens, in order for systemic change to successfully take place in what would then be transformation times, and it envisaged that to be from the period of sort of now through to 2050. The teens were obviously supposed to be done by now. You can move to the next slide, Filippo. Less well known is that it also actually took the time to identify a number of risks and wildcards. These were seen as potential barriers to progress to the achievement of the vision. And in fact, many of them did indeed materialize to one degree or another over the last 10 years, but the societal mitigation strategies that were required did not. Neither government, business, nor society took these threats as seriously as they needed to. And as a consequence, making progress against our vision has been made harder. If you go to the next slide, please, Filippo. So drawing on some comments made by our EXCO member, Harry Breckelmans from Shell, I'll just quote, "I know you often refer to the predictive qualities of the previous Vision 2050 effort in the context of the turbulent teens, and would also say that I expect fully to see the turbulent 20s and likely turbulent 30s too. So let's start visioning these in more detail." So we knew from the very beginning of the Refresh project that we needed to think about what the next 10 years might throw at business. Not just in terms of sustainability challenges, we wanted to explore more generally what the world would look like, and also consider how that would affect businesses' ability to operate successfully, so they can also operate sustainably. Next slide, Filippo. So the question for us was really how best to generate a picture of the future that business could use to properly plan the way in which it would react to events that could both prevent as well as assist progress towards Vision 2050 over the next 10 years. Although we would have loved to have spent as much more time exploring scenarios and reflexive futures and a whole range of other foresighting methods in support of this picture, in the end we settled on a fairly simple way of investigating this. So the first thing we did was to step back from sustainability and to look at a number of different landscapes that affect businesses' ability to operate: politics, economics, society, technology, environment, regulations. You'll recognize those as the pestle categorization. We wanted to see what trends we could see within these landscapes today that was so well established that they would likely continue or deepen over the next 10 years. So these are our highly likely macro trends. Secondly, we wanted to look at the trends that we could see developing that had slightly weaker signals, that were slightly less likely to occur, but that nonetheless were completely plausible. And if they did occur, what significant impacts would they cause? So those are our disruptions. And finally, then, we would need to think about how these would impact our Vision 2050 pathways, both in terms of intensifying or alleviating the challenges themselves, as well as our ability to make progress towards our vision of 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries. So if you go to the next slide, Filippo. There we go. Nope, one back. There we go. We started by interviewing a number of our members within the Vision 2050 project about their view of the decade to come. We spoke to a huge range of people with different roles, from the chief economist of one of our members through to someone whose title was Director of Human and Cultural Futures and Sustainability. Absolutely brilliant title. We also partnered with Volans, who I'm sure many of you know, and we built on these interviews and our own desk research to help us create a very long research document, which we'll also be making available, covering these different landscapes in depth. In the end, we actually moved away from a pestle organization of the landscapes and categorized our thinking in terms of demographics, environment, economics, technology, politics, and culture. And we've also produced a short summary of this long research, which is where we've drawn out the macro trends and disruptions that we believe business should prepare for. And that's really what I'll be talking through today with you, although I'll probably focus on the trends this morning and the disruptions this afternoon. But we'll share everything in the recordings after the event. It's important to note that we're not trying to put a particular spin, either positive or negative, on the analysis. The point is to take a clear-eyed view of what the 2020s might have in store, so that business can develop more effective strategies for how to respond and make progress on well, in our case, Vision 2050, but to plan how to operate successfully and sustainably through the decade ahead. We need strategies that harness the momentum created by the trends, that can act both as tailwinds, and we also need strategies that are resilient and adaptive in the face of inevitable headwinds. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. So obviously, the elephant or the rhino in the room is COVID-19. We cannot possibly talk about these trends without also recognizing the fact that everything appears to be changing as a result of COVID-19 at the moment. We have adapted this work, which was all done at the end of last year, to recognize the short-term, medium-term and long-term impacts that COVID-19 is likely to have. But essentially, these macro trends and disruptions were long-term, structurally embedded features of society and of business, and therefore COVID-19 hasn't made them go away in any way. These are still absolutely apparent in the world that we're living in, and they're likely to unfold or deepen or alleviate depending on the actions that we take. So they're still the right trends for us to be talking about. Just so you know, if you click on the next slide, Filippo, there's another session on Wednesday where we'll be focusing specifically in on the way that COVID-19 will be affecting the decade to come, with a focus on what it means for long-term resilience for business. So do acknowledge the fact that as I go through these trends, they are not all about COVID-19, but we haven't ignored the fact that it will be impacting these things in some way. And we're also doing some very deep work to look at how it will affect business over the decade and what businesses' options are in terms of response as well. So if you move on. So let's move on to the data now. The macro trends I'll start with, you've got to think of these as a big river. Its course is largely set for the next 10 years. If the river is heading where you need it to head, you can protect its course. If the river is heading towards risky land or seems to be running out of steam, so to speak, then you can act to protect the river's flow, but its course is kind of set. So that's how we think about the macro trends. If you move to the next slide, Filippo. We identified 2 macro trends in each of the 6 categories that we have organized our thinking around. And there's a logic to the order in which we've thought about these things, which is to move from those things that we can be most certain of towards ever greater ambiguity. So world population and demographics are largely locked in, as are environmental impacts, whereas politics and cultural shifts are far more fluid and can change very quickly, as we've seen over and over again during the last 10 years. So I'll go through each of these in some detail, and then we'll see where we are timing-wise down the line. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. So demographics. The global population, of course, continues to grow. It also ages, and as you all know, it continues to urbanize. There'll be more than 1 billion over 65s, and 2/3 of us will live in cities. But over the next 10 years, we thought 2 trends are worth noting. The first is the balance of power will start to shift away from boomers and towards millennials and Gen Z. This isn't necessarily an even shift. For instance, a lot of financial power will still be held by boomers. Furthermore, there are geographic shifts to consider. Asia, the Middle East and Africa have the largest millennial cohorts. In India, there are 365 million millennials alone. And then Europe, North America, and Oceania have the biggest groups of boomers. The millennials haven't had it easy. They came of age around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, and these tensions will continue to surface over the next decade. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. Furthermore, African and Asian populations are going to continue to grow the fastest. They're going to contribute to the ongoing shift of geo-economic power. And whilst that is a huge opportunity, it will also put strain on natural and political resources. Water, for instance, will be increasingly critical, with 4 of the 5 most vulnerable hotspots for water wars being in Africa or Asia. Rising prosperity, coupled with near certain increases in frequency and impact of natural disasters, will make both Africa and Asia far more mobile than they've been in the past. And high levels of emigration and immigration are both laden with political risks. Go to the next slide, Filippo. Environment. Everyone on this call will be keenly aware of the number of planetary boundaries human society is already in breach of. Our economic, social, political, and health systems all have high levels of interdependence with the environment. For instance, the increased risk of pandemics arising from a combination of climate change, of biodiversity loss, and of deforestation. Other slow-moving crises, for instance, soil degradation, also impact the productivity of vital sectors such as agriculture. It's highly likely that impacts and awareness will grow over the next 10 years. Firstly, through worsening climate impacts, which will increasingly damage property, undermine livelihoods, and reduce the productivity of land and labour. But it also seems certain that pressure on governments and business to act will therefore increase, thus scaling up both transition risks and opportunities. On the political front, this could benefit progressive and protectionist or nationalist politicians all around the world. It could go either way. And you'll also notice as we go through these macro trends that the further into the level of ambiguity you get, the more role there is for people to actually push the trend one way or the other. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. Sorry, the last one. Climate will be the biggest, but not the only story of the decade. More localized challenges will have significant consequences for business and society. Soil, land, air quality will all be of concern, air quality particularly in Asia and Africa, where the most new megacities will be. And as already mentioned, water will have to go further with each passing year. By 2025, over 2/3 of the world population could be living in water-stressed countries. These challenges must catalyze innovation and regulation that ensure we manage resources responsibly and do more with less. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. On the economy, clearly COVID-19 has completely transformed the short-term outlook, but the long-term trajectory for the economy was far from certain. Structural weaknesses were very high at the start of the year. For instance, underinvestment, high debt and inequality, slow productivity growth, stranded asset risks, to name a few. A swift recovery from this crisis does not seem likely. But it also actually presents us with an opportunity for a political reset if voters and politicians are brave enough to rise to the challenge. We could well be entering the deepest contraction in centuries. Governments and households will emerge from this with severely weakened balance sheets. So even though the slowdown was already baked into the economy, it's going to hit faster and much harder than we thought. But that also means that the political calculus behind an economic slowdown has changed. There are massive fiscal stimulus packages on the table in nearly every country that can afford them and some that can't. State intervention could kickstart recovery in service of long-term societal goals and sustainable growth. But we could also see a prolonged period of stagflation in the developed world and untold suffering in the developing world because they simply lack the means to bail themselves out. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. Also already baked into the global economy was the long talked about economic shift to the East, which would finally happen in the decade to come. This decade, perhaps earlier now, Asia's share of global GDP will push past 50% and it will continue to rise. Countries and regions that Asia, and in particular that China favors, will benefit, of course, from this. As a result, trade tensions will continue to remain a feature of geopolitics, and the COVID-19 crisis will likely accelerate the fragmentation of trade regions around the world. Supply chains will likely be shortened, and there will be a renewed focus on self-sufficiency. 2019 may well have been peak globalization. And the last thing to mention around this is that the tensions around the control of vital raw materials are almost now certainly likely to increase over the following 10 years. Go to the next slide, Filippo. Another area of trends that have been amplified by the COVID-19 crisis is technology. E-commerce, remote working, online learning, and telemedicine have all received a huge boost in the recent months for the lucky few around the world who can actually benefit those things. And it's important to remember that the people on this call are not everyone around the world, obviously. Furthermore, vaccine research has been completely turbocharged, and automation of production and distribution is seen as a way of restricting the spread of the virus and increasing supply chain resilience in the future. The question, as always with technology, is how do we ensure net positive societal outcomes from its use? How equitably will the gains from technological progress be shared? Tech's winner-take-all dynamics have not gone away, and governments are still muddling through how best to intervene. Although they do appear to be increasingly committed to taking action, they will need to step this up if market concentration and inequality are to be avoided. Nonetheless, the spread of automation through every industry will accelerate. Growing maturity of technologies such as AI, robotics, and 3D printing will fuel this future growth. Automation will put a further strain on the link between work and economic security. But COVID-19 may, in fact, lead to stronger social safety nets, mitigating the impact of automation on workers. However, if COVID-19 leads to austerity measures, automation could lead to increased inequality within and between countries, and therefore fan the flames of further populism. Reskilling is going to become a major topic. Shorter supply chains will be driven by leading-edge manufacturing and services technologies more than they will by cheap labor. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. And again, a trend towards more data-driven and thus more surveilled societies has been accelerated by COVID-19. Focus right now is on the government use of data and tracking to control the spread of the virus. And some countries have put quite extreme measures in place, which there's no guarantee that they will remove once this crisis has passed. But the use of data had already exploded across all industries. In areas such as manufacturing, food production, and logistics, there are huge productivity gains available with clear economic and environmental wins. Potential also exists within the finance industry, assessing loans and investments more neutrally through data, while also incorporating sustainable development considerations into how financial flows are directed. But the only thing that will direct the net benefits towards society will be social or governmental intervention, not just in terms of increased inequality and decreased competition, but also by addressing challenges such as algorithmic bias. We have more information on this in our disruption section, but essentially some form of techlash will be the only thing that reins in the inevitable trajectory of the gains from tech. So we'll talk about that in a minute. If you move to the next slide, Filippo. Polarization and populism within politics have been growing over the past decade, and there doesn't really seem to be an obvious end in sight. COVID-19 responses have actually highlighted the strength of nationalism and the weakness of multilateralism. There will be opportunities to rebuild a more effective global order in the next few months, but there is absolutely no guarantee that governments will take them. However, the gradual handover of political power to a generation that prioritizes equality and climate action, for instance, not to mention the increasing numbers of women in politics, does give hope. The social, environmental, and economic disruptions that lie ahead are more than likely to keep fueling populism and radicalism. Dissatisfaction and helplessness pushes people to the edges, both those in power, those seeking it, and the general public itself. But this kind of environment also lays the ground for radical alternatives, such as the post-Great Recession New Deal. So we hope that effort is placed in those kinds of radical alternatives rather than others that are less likely to contribute to stability. And if you go to the next slide, Filippo, that's because, sadly, global stability suffers when populists are in power. Not just because multilateralism is weakened, but also because they seem less interested in the complexity of the world, the linked interests of allies, or between rich and poor countries, or the need for long-term planning and investment. These areas of governance tend to get ignored. There are multiple hotspots around the world, especially as nations in relative decline or whose long-term prospects are threatened by economic, environmental, or social change, have less and less incentive to adhere to the rules that underpin present and future global stability. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. Culture. Culture is always changing, and it's shaped largely by shifts in other areas, such as urbanization, or climate, or technology, or politics. But we see two trends that are particularly relevant for business over the next 10 years. Firstly, the attitudes to ownership really do begin to shift. In the ways that individuals measure their status around the world and success, we really do see changes, although it does vary dramatically between countries. 70% of Chinese say that their measure of success is of the things that they own, whereas only 21% of Spaniards and Swedes agree. In developed economies, and particularly among younger age cohorts, more people are starting to value experiences and access over ownership. But that also might have something to do with the fact that they are less able to own things in the ways that previous generations were. The sharing economy, on demand, and product as a service models being made available by increasingly mature technologies are spreading across all industries. So we see definite shifts in the way that people view the consumerist lifestyle, if you want to call it that. And it remains to be seen what the effects of this period of confinement for over half the world's population will be. If you go to the next slide, Felipe. However, we also see values dividing and deepening and ossifying within many nations around the world. Polarizing events from the Brexit vote in the UK to new citizenship laws in India are both a symptom and a cause of these divides. A polarized and fragmented social media landscape, media and social media landscape, also exacerbates these trends. There's no single issue defining these cultural tensions. They're about attitudes to race or religion, immigration, gender, sexuality, place, globalism, nationhood, and many more. And they don't necessarily map perfectly onto demographic divides either. In many countries, there's a strong urban-rural or a strong old-young dimension to the cultural wars. Very often, education level is a strong predictor of people's cultural views. These tensions contribute to the political polarization that we see, and in turn, they also feed off it. It's a reinforcing feedback loop. So there's a risk that clashes over identity can and will intensify over the decade ahead. So that covers the trends, the macro trends that we wanted to cover. If you go to the next slide, Filippo. I'll spend a bit of time on the disruptions, and I've used an image of a volcano to introduce this because there's quite a nice link with how volcanoes erupt. Number one, they erupt suddenly, and the impacts from their eruptions can be absolutely enormous. But with the current COVID-19 crisis front and center of everyone's minds, we are actually able to measure the behavior of volcanoes. We can tell when they're getting close to an eruption. It's very rare these days that eruptions are a complete and utter surprise. And so we should think about the disruptions that the world faces in the same way. We can look at the world around us. We can scan where tensions exist. We can measure the health of societies. We can predict with some certainty whether an eruption may be possible and therefore prepare for it. And that's really the point of these disruptions. Now, as I said at the beginning of the call, we don't unfortunately have time to do both the macro trends and the disruptions in full, so I'll focus more on the disruptions this afternoon. But if you go to the next slide, Filippo, I just thought I'd show you the 10 that we've identified for the year and for the decade ahead, and just blitz through what some of these are. So we've got financial crisis, global pandemic, it could very well happen again, major conflict, an economic singularity, popular revolts leading to regime change, a climate Minsky moment, energy transition reaching a tipping point, societal and regulatory tech clash, biotech boom, and global Green New Deal as the 10 major disruptions that we feel business should do everything in its power to both consider, prepare for, and potentially think about how it can encourage these things, well, should these things happen, how it can encourage a response to these in support of a more sustainable future. So some of the ones, if we just spend a few moments on one or two, we can look at things like financial crisis. We obviously know that this is already in flow. We know that global pandemic is already in flow. We know that the energy transition is already likely occurring. We know that popular revolts are bubbling under the surface all over the world. And all of these things are somehow being potentially accelerated or slowed down by the way in which we respond to COVID-19. So very relevant right now. Major conflict, if we look at that for a second, We know that the underlying reasons for conflict to take place are growing around the world. There are examples such as the challenges being faced in river deltas, the Nile Delta, affecting a number of countries, with many of them not entirely happy with what's going on up the river. Similarly, I think the Mekong Delta is also being affected by actions being taken by a number of different countries. Those types of things are relatively well known. Less well known is the fact that some defense analysts already consider many countries to be in a state of war. It's just that that war is not taking place physically. It's taking place through cyber attacks and snooping around critical infrastructure. The point is that were any of these things to escalate over the next 10 years, it will touch all ordinary citizens in a conflict, not just those who are asked to go to war. If we look at a climate Minsky moment, this is simply the idea that it's possible for for something to be re-evaluated in terms of its value almost overnight. A sudden downward revision of asset valuations in carbon-intensive sectors. Were that to occur, what would the effect be on many of the sectors that are tied to energy production and manufacturing? A societal and regulatory tech clash, we've talked about that a little bit, but this is just the idea that increasingly we don't accept the level of surveillance or the level of intrusion that technology is capable of within our lives. And we sour on the costs of free technology, and treasuries sour on the lost taxes and competition that result from the current model that we see in operation. What happens if that if that happens more significantly than it currently is? So I've gone over time, but that's just a very quick run through of some of the disruptions that we've looked at. And as I said, I'll look at them in greater detail in the call this afternoon. Filippo, if you go to the next slide quickly, just before we pass on to the speakers. Filippo found this quote from Steven Pinker, a very well-known professor of psychology, but who's also done work in economics. And he said this late last year: the 2020s will be filled with problems, crises, and discord, just like the decades before and after. And problems are inevitable, but problems are solvable. And solutions create new problems that can be solved in their turn. And all this really to say that we want to highlight the importance of doing this kind of forward scanning work in order to identify where those inevitable problems lie, where those slightly less certain problems lie, but we should nonetheless prepare for, so that we can figure out how we might solve them and how solutions might create not just new problems, but also new opportunities for us. And that really, without doing this work, we only react in the short term and don't think about how we continually, all of us as businesses, as participants in society, as participants in policy-making processes, how we influence the trajectory of the world. And if we have a direction that we want to go in, then we must work in order to make that happen. And so that's really the point of all of this work. And with that, I hand back over to Filippo to introduce the speakers who are going to react they're all very familiar to the work that we've done. So their reactions may be to the disruptions or to the macro trends. We just ask for their thoughts on this work in general. Thanks, Filippo.
Thank you, Julian, for the comprehensive overview on both the trends and the disruptions. And I think, as you rightly mentioned, all of this is, of course, consolidated also in writing in much further detail and will be made available to you in the days to come. We are in the final stages of putting it all together, including on the COVID-19 deep dive through an issue brief, so that it complements both the longer term trends alongside the deep dive on COVID-19. So building on Julian's insights on the back of the work with members in the Vision 2050 project, we have the pleasure of welcoming three member representatives on today's session, on today's call. And I wanted to call individually on each of them sort of sequentially in terms of inviting them to provide some comments and insights in terms of what they hear, but also what they're thinking through within their particular companies. And I'll start off with David Hone, a long-standing colleague of WBCSD and supporter of WBCSD's work in his function as Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell. And David, I see you on the line. We tested the sound, so everything should be fine. And I'm handing over to you for some initial comments with regard to this particular topic.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Philippa, and thanks, Julian, for a very comprehensive piece of analysis. So in Shell, we're also looking at these issues particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I work in the Shell scenario team, and we have a scenario exercise now underway to really try and think through, or at least rethink, the 2020s. And in fact, that's the name of the piece of work that we're doing. I think one thing that's clear is that the operating environment is changing very rapidly. And I think a new balance is emerging, which actually will change the key macro trends that you talked about. So the balance that we sort of see, and we're still in the early stages of this work, is a balance between the role of government, between the economy, and between, obviously, the welfare of people. And this is playing out in different ways. So some governments are looking, first and foremost at the economy, and struggling as to how they manage that in terms of the welfare of the people. Others are looking more at the welfare of the people, and then wondering how, of course, this plays out with the economy. And so all of these three elements are shifting, I think, to a new balance that we have to be aware of. It's not clear what that balance is. And in a scenario team, one of the things we do is look at the prospect of different balances. And I think that this project is going to have to think about that as well. What are the different balances that might emerge? And those different balances could well affect the way in which countries are able to dig themselves out of the mess that they're currently in. And so you could see very different ways in which countries come out of the lockdown and restart their economies, depending on how they view this, or how this balance emerges. I think we've got really very little experience to refer to in such a deep and knotty problem. But it's interesting to look back to almost exactly a century ago. We're following the Great War. The world was plunged into a pandemic, which was the Spanish flu, and is referred to a lot. Now that of course, it started in the United States, and it spread globally and caused a great deal of disruption for a period of about 18 months to 2 years. But it's instructive to look at what happened afterwards, and it didn't end well. The 2020s, one of the biggest boom periods of the 20th century. Not just economically booming, and that is the part that obviously led to severe disruption in the 2030s, but technological boom as well, in that many of the innovations that landed and rooted themselves in the 20th century blossomed in the 1920s. And so I think, if you'd been sitting there in 1919, coming out of the Great War and in the middle of a pandemic, and then looking to the sort of the small depression, the recession and then the depression that took place in the very early part of the 1920s, you wouldn't have imagined the boom that took place. It wasn't called the Roaring Twenties for nothing. Now, that's not to say that will repeat itself, but I think we have to be prepared for outcomes that we don't imagine. And what happened then was that, thinking became quite short term. There was an immediate major problem to solve. And it did get solved in that short term, but it left lasting change right through the century and right up till today. And I think some of the macroeconomic trends or macro trends did change. You know, arguably we started the pathway to globalization. And I think, Julian, you talked about globalization, and I agree that, you know, physical globalization may well change as a result of this, this pandemic and be brought back more towards home. But digital globalization could well go in the other direction. And we may well see an incredible boom in digitalization that you know, will put to, which will sort of make what we've seen so far look relatively minor. And by digital globalization, I mean the fact that various parts of the digital supply chain can exist anywhere. And that's been really enhanced, and we've seen that, you know, just in the last month. I think you know, we talk a lot about the possibility of greening the economy, and I think stimulus bills or stimulus action that comes forward over the coming, you know, 2 years may well encompass that. But I think don't necessarily expect that this will be something that will shift the whole climate debate or fundamentally shift energy trends. It may be that it's very, very rapid and very deep in some sectors where there's enormous possibility for rapid change, because it's rapid change that governments will be looking for. So they're going to be investing in things that are ready to roll, things that can deliver high employment benefits and stimulus to the economy in the very short term. And many of the things that we need in the climate space, some of them fall into that category, but many of them still need a lot of longer term nurturing that we may not see perhaps in the 2020s, when we know that's a period when we need them to come forward. And then I think, yeah, in terms of the shift in political power and demographics, I wonder if there isn't a possibility that the millennials get skipped. And I think that's something that we might want to think about. It's pretty clear that, you know, there's too many baby boomers clinging on. And we see it in the US presidential election, not just in the two who are likely to now to fight it out, but in the wide range of people who they had around them were all in their 70s. And I find that troubling, because I think it is time to move on. And you look at many other leaders around the world, they're you know, it is baby boomers clinging on. And does that bring a backlash where we not skip the millennials completely, but go more towards the next group whose political power will be rising rapidly, and may wish not to be the left behind generation, as they sort of view the millennials being somewhat left behind as a result of the financial crisis, and actually use their political influence and power. So I think that's the last point I wanted to make, is that we may come out of this with some very deep wells that have to be sorted out in certain sectors. This is by no means a sort of an averaging across many sectors. Travel, tourism, and what's linked to them are clearly very, very deeply affected. And it's an area that I looked through the WBCSD membership, and it's not widely represented, that sector. There are some companies that have operations in that sector, but it's not as widely represented as, say, the industrial sectors. But all those other sectors, of course, depend on movement and travel and tourism for many of the goods and services that they supply. And this is a sector that could change profoundly throughout the 2020s. So I think that's enough for me. I think, you know, this is a great start, but I think, you need to think about some of the new balances that will emerge, and also that some of these macro trends may actually be shifting, and they're not as rooted as in the 2020s as perhaps you had thought. But thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for always pertinent insights and feedback, and certainly food for thought for all of us as we work through these pieces and as we head forward in the year around the refresh of Vision 2050. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask, I've seen she's on the line. I don't have her on the screen here, but I've seen she's on the line. Anne Gadegaard, our colleague from Novo Nordisk. She's Associate Director and Senior Advisor in the area of global prevention and health promotion. Anne, I wanted to kindly ask you for your perspectives, how do you build on what David shared, and what additional perspectives would you like to bring to the table this morning? And over to you.
Thank you, Filippo, and
Hi.
thank you. Hi, I am here.
Good.
In the hiding though, but I'm here, and you're getting the real life experience of the first floor of where I'm located right now, because we're only partly back into the headquarter offices. So we take turns in going back to headquarter, and then some days we're still working from home.
Okay.
So thank you very much, guys, for this opportunity for us to share our perspectives on trends and disruption, because I'll touch a little bit upon both. And also a special thanks to you guys in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development team for your continued effort in making this process happen. I definitely think the time being this is has even shown much more valuable, but also much more difficult to deal with. And I think with the famous word of Winston Churchill, that it's always wise to look ahead, but very difficult to look further than what you can see. And I think that COVID-19 is definitely learning all of us that this is very true. And I think to David's last words in terms of we've spent time and many conversations on the identified trends and wildcards, but you never really know how and when it will evolve. We don't have this, I think the English word is seismographs maybe, to identify the volcano eruptions for many of these trends. But I do think there are information and data out there, and I do think there's something about how we create insights by actually looking into how information and data is generated in the future to come, to be much more clever as businesses, but also as governments and regions, the world, in order to understand how these insights is actually forming a better road towards what are the trends and how will we potentially be impacted by this in order to adjust, either by adaptation or mitigation. And then Julian and David, thank you so much for making my job much more hard. I really like the challenge. Whether I'll live up to it, I don't know. So I will just share a few thoughts on both the content of what has been presented here today, but also a few perspectives on where we are in terms of thinking how this will form the way that at least we will look and engage with the world going forward. I think both as an individual, but also from a company perspective, there hasn't been like really big surprises in terms of the identified risk and wildcards. I think highlighting the importance of Asia and Africa and their importance in how both the it will play out, but also by the speed and the magnitude of the challenges, is a pretty good reminder to the whole way that maybe we've been looking too generalistic on globalization, not just in terms of physical or virtual globalization and how that will play out, but actually also how I'm very not happy and confident talking about the shift of power, but how the influence of different parts of the world will be significantly bigger than it has been so far. I think, and due to the effort of World Business Council and many other organizations, how not least business sectors, but also how governments are handling these trends, and now specifically to the COVID-19, is being highlighted now. Where can we work together differently in order to deal with some of the challenges? Where do we actually get an insight into industries or sectors that have had a view to the world could actually look different? And also, unfortunately, to where that has not necessarily been something that has been built into the view on how business should progress. I think Shell is very fortunate to have people like David helping them understanding scenarios and how trends will play out. I do think that could potentially be a key factor in order to create this world of insights going forward, is that how can many countries and sectors even understand this scenario planning as part of how you actually can build a resilient business for the future. Then specific to the company I work for, Novo Nordisk, which for those of you who might not have been introduced so far, is a Danish-based healthcare company with a global reach. We are not insignificant in terms of size. So I think some of you might have at least experienced some thoughts from this part of the chain of globalization. So I think, as I said, it's not been really a big surprise to many of the trends. And I think for us, it's very much a time perspective in how we are working with the different trends. So the trends around demographics and technology and politics have always been influencing the way that we do business. So we come out of R&D, so innovation is what we do. So these factors has always been influencing how we can evolve as a business. In addition to that, we have, of course, based on an formation of values, and that also means that the trends around environment and culture is something that we are working on. We are trying to figure out how it will impact the flow of what we do as a business. It has been very in terms of operationalizing it and how we do our business, but now it also becomes a way of how we're planning to do business going forward. So it has had a more medium to the long-term perspective in terms of how we're dealing with it. And then, of course, economics. It's all about how much you can say the world is capable of paying for innovation. But also, what is innovation? Is innovation just directly linked to what we do as a business, being the pharmaceuticals? Or will we actually also have to move into much more different terms of service level agreements in terms of how economics will be rewarding what we're doing as a business? I think part of the conversation, I think you, Julian, alluded to it during your presentation, is the whole how are we then going to deal with these risk and trends, risk and wildcards? I think very much there is you can say instant reaction is that we think mitigation. I think I'm actually sometimes surprised that the whole notion of adaptation is not as present, at least not communicated, and maybe it's because it's you can say business opportunity, and you don't want to spread all the information before you actually manifested it as part of your business. But actually figuring out, okay, we can either deal with this trend that we are seeing in a matter of protecting our business, or actually we could, if we just spend some time in understanding this, how can we use it in an adaptive way in order to understand how we can do our business differently, not just pitching yet another innovation, but how we can actually work together throughout different silos of the world in order to actually have a greater value contribution to the societies around. So that part, I think, I would really look forward to see, and I do think COVID-19 will push that kind of thinking slightly more, understanding the interconnectedness of all of this thing, and now we can come up with those solutions that David was referring to in terms of ready to roll, that's at least how I heard it, David, ready to roll solution that will generate work and benefit and value to society. And that brings me to one of kind of the bigger questions that we've also had in the group in terms of the whole measurement of welfare of economies. Will it just be financial value? Will it be GDP that will be the expression for how we understand the potential of society going forward? And I do think a historic reference here is also needed, being that the founder of the modern version of GDP, Simon Kuznets, actually referred to is in his original report that maybe GDP is not the best measure for welfare, and that we do need to keep in mind that there is both a quantitative and a qualitative element to this, and maybe it's time to figure out how this is going to be activated and how we as private sector can actually build into that, not storytelling, but the understanding of what sort of value is it that we are creating, and what sort of value is government going to look for in terms of us actually playing an active part of making that transition from just a sole, the way at least that we look at GDP today. And then finally, I think, and thank you, Julian, for alluding to that. I think I was not setting down notes, but I think at least 3 times you were talking about inequalities. So in addition, I think inequality is kind of, sewed into the document that's been prepared as part of the project. But I do think that, and this is the conversation, not all of the conversation, but part of the conversation in Novo Nordisk right now, that inequality will be a red thread throughout. Whether it's economic perspective, social perspective, or environmental perspective, we do think, in addition to health, of course, but that inequality will be a driver for the decisions, the discussions, and the decisions being made to a much higher degree than it has been so far. So that was the reflections from this end of the world. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and much appreciated the thoughts from a healthcare sector perspective, and thank you for joining us from Denmark with those thoughts, and very much looking forward to continuing the work, of course, around this refresh of the vision and weaving in the various red threads, to quote you, in particular one on inequality, of course, and looking also, of course, at the role of innovations across the decade to come, etc., etc. So exciting work done, but also exciting work lying ahead with you and the other members. Duncan Pollard, I call upon you as a representative of Nestle. I also saw you were on my little windows there. If I could also ask you to build on Anne and David Holmes' perspectives, what would be your thoughts with a Nestle hat on and with your vast experience over the past few decades in this area of sustainability and the implications looking ahead, in particular the 10 years ahead? What are your thoughts? Duncan, the word is over to you.
Well, thank you, Filippo, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, Filippo and Julian, congratulations on the work so far, particularly the issues brief that you sent out last week on the consequences of COVID-19 and what this pandemic means for the decade ahead, and also for of course this work on macro trends, which I think, we're in the very lucky situation, if you want to call it, that COVID has made us pay more attention to this particular aspect of the Vision 2050 work. Thank you also, David, for your thought-provoking comments around the top-line trends and the balance, and Anne, thank you for referencing and reminding us of adaptation and the importance of adaptation. It reminds me, one thing that I'm spending a lot of time working on at the moment is putting our climate roadmap together, and most of the discourse that we hear and most of the emphasis that companies are putting on tackling climate change at the moment is how to get onto the 1.5 degree pathway or the below 2 degree pathway, whichever one you've chosen. And yet there's only a 1% chance that that's the likely outcome. There's a 50% chance it's going to be 3.2 or 3.5 degrees, and very few people are focused on that. So adaptation, I do believe, is the other thing that we ought to be thinking a lot about, at least as we try and operationalize this stuff. You know, there's a couple of things I want to talk about and mention, Filippo, just to try and add something new to what's been said by my colleagues who've come before me. I mean, clearly, COVID is framing the current discourse, but I don't think we should overemphasize this. As Julian said, it's the rhino in the room, and yet I don't think, honestly speaking, that as sustainability professionals we've learned anything we didn't already know about it when it comes to what we have to do and what the outcomes are that we would like for society. The content is the same, quite frankly, in terms of what we have to do. The external context, at least in terms of these macro trends, is the same. Now, of course, the emphasis is different, and David has you know, made that point when he says the balance is different. But you know, I think that we still have our job to do as sustainability professionals, and certainly for Nestle, the sustainability focus is still about climate change. It's still about plastics. It's still about biodiversity, livelihoods, and food systems. And certainly there's more emphasis on livelihoods and inequality and food systems. But my sense is that COVID has just made it easier for us as professionals to embed our ideas and what we want as outcomes into how the business operates. You know, for example, how do we deal with suppliers? Suddenly flexibility is out and resilience is in, and that's got to be good for the way that we operate. You know, so and then when it comes to WBCSD, and I do think that and this 2050 vision work, I do think that the work on the capitalism of the future is central to what we're doing. Femke Gruthuis of the X-Tax project was quoted just last week as saying it's not how much profit companies make, it's how the profit is made, which I think sums up very neatly what our challenge is as the 200 member companies in WBCSD is to help frame that or reframe that. So, you know, when I look at these key trends and the disruptions that we have, I go back to what Jose Lopez always used to say, that if you want to change things, especially in a complex system, then you need to change the circumstances. Well, certainly COVID has changed those circumstances. So the question for us is, how do we translate this, all of this, into our day-to-day work? How do we build an alignment of small actions across the WBCSD companies so that we can collectively nudge the corporate world to accelerate some of the trends that we want to see and the outcomes that are positive society? I think we'll all have to work and understand this for ourselves, but what's the collective action that we want for WBCSD and its member companies? I don't have the answer to these, but my sense is that the WBCSD Vision 2050 does need to focus on providing some answers and some guidance for us all. So I'll end there, Filippo. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Duncan. Good to see you on the screen, and thank you for those thoughts, in particular positioning this idea of COVID, almost, if I may say, as an enabler almost for enhancing resilience and accelerating some of the changes that in the sustainability profession we have been identifying for a long time. And thank you also for providing the question and the challenge, of course, to the Vision 2050 team overall and all of us across the membership in terms of the collective action implications that we should take into account as we shape this going forward, and as we also move it towards finalizing it and some of the so what's and the actions for the organization and for the members to rally behind it. So thank you to the three member representatives across Shell, Novo Nordisk, and Nestle for those thoughts. I do not see, unless I'm mistaken, and I'm asking my colleagues, but I do not see any questions other than one which was specifically directed at David Hone by Tilina. But unfortunately, David Hone had to step out of the call about 10 or so minutes ago. So he's not in position to answer that, but we will have Shell back on the call this afternoon, and we will make sure to raise that particular question. I don't see any other questions or comments coming in. I don't know, Julian, do you have any particular reaction to what was said by Anne and Duncan from your end?
Yes, more work.
Apart from that, of course.
No, so one of the things to mention is that actually it was Duncan who had originally asked us to think harder about the ambiguity of how some of the macro trends might play out, the direction that they might head in. And so we did do some more thinking around that, and David sort of raised a point that linked directly to that thinking around how perhaps the millennials might simply get skipped. Mm-hmm. And so when the summary issue brief comes out next week, you will see more thinking around some of those ambiguities. And we had explored different ideas about how there might be different political engagement reactions from millennials and Gen Z, in terms of either far greater engagement or acceptance of the status quo in a pre-COVID world where they could kind of rely on some level of economic stability. But I don't think we fully considered the idea of them just literally completely stepping out, and what the effect on Gen Z would be of that. So there's definitely some more thought to be done there. I love the use of the thinking about the 20s in more detail, which we didn't do. What we have done, and you'll find out more about on the call on Wednesday, is we have tried to think about the responses to the 2008 financial crisis as a way of giving business and policymakers some guidance about what may not be in the best interest of society in how we respond to the COVID-19 crisis, because there were very long-term effects of the stimulus packages that were issued in 2010 and the austerity that followed. So, but what we hadn't done, again, is like drawing on David's ideas, was thinking about what the effects might be over 100 years. So that, that does give you a different lens completely. In terms of Anne's comments, she's right. Adaptation hasn't been considered strongly enough, and I love this idea of leaning into specific changes that we can actually do something very interesting with in order to benefit society at a much more common level. And we also haven't really considered the qualitative nature of measuring societal success. So perhaps that is something that needs to be done more. And in terms of Duncan's comments, I think I'm grateful that I've got someone saying that we don't need to tear up the macro trends, that they are all still there, and that COVID-19 doesn't completely change everything. But I think the comments on how business can leverage this change in circumstances to advantage both the speed of the recovery, but the sustainability of the response as well, of the long-term outlook, is one that we will be looking at in far more detail in our pieces of work that we do on COVID, stemming out of the vision work. And I think, Filippo, you'll say a very quick few words on that at the end. But those are my quick reactions. My thanks, as always, to the the insights of our members and for sharing them publicly on this call. So thank you.
Brilliant. Just a follow-up question. There's an interesting comment by our colleague Hitesh Kataria, who says that, you know, we presented the mega trends, but she could not. Can you maybe elicit a little bit of? Can you maybe provide some thought around how the interconnection between these trends and how they interact? So here the example raised is, how does economic recovery, whether it's delayed or not delayed, have an impact on our progress to reach the Paris Agreement, for example? So the interconnectedness of the trends and the disruption, is there something not only visually to depict, but how could it be drawn out?
Yeah, so we have an external review committee for the Vision 2050 project, made up of a number of leading lights from around the world, trying to represent different geographies, but also expertise. So it's not just sustainability, it's also people from, you know, for instance, the Confederation of Indian Industries, or from the Global Environment Facility, which is a sort of a supranational body very much focused on financing climate action around the world. And that exact question came up about the systemic linkages between these different areas. And the simple answer to your question is, we have tried in the document to draw the most obvious links out between both the macro trends themselves and between the disruptions. But at the end of the day, either we choose to do it in depth with a proper systems expert, and we do the systems analysis and we actually draw it out visually so that people can understand it, what will be an incredibly messy picture, or we accept that these things are all entirely interrelated. So COVID-19 is very clearly demonstrating the domino nature of how one disruption triggers many answers. So we've got global pandemic, which is most likely going to trigger an economic and perhaps a financial crisis too. It could ultimately trigger conflicts, or at the very least uprisings for those who are less fortunate through the way in which their governments manage the recovery. And that in itself could lead to regime change. Similarly, you've got technological, financial, and political dimensions to the energy transition. You mentioned Paris there, so that affects transitions within energy, within transport, within food, within manufacturing. Duncan was just talking about the different scenarios that they have to plan for in terms of how their agricultural output is managed. And so, you know, with many of these, if one happens, the likelihood is others occur as well. So we have looked at it in the document, but it's a very messy question to try and answer, because inevitably you could say, you could simply answer it by saying they are all interrelated.
Thanks, Julian. I'm looking at the time. We gave ourselves 90 minutes max, and I think it's time to slowly wrap up this particular session. As I mentioned, I think in the introduction, we're going to do a second session later on today at 4 p.m. Central European Time, Geneva time, with a number of additional perspectives and with a deeper dive on the disruptions in particular. So allow me just to wrap up with a few sort of housekeeping items. But first and foremost, I really want to thank our members, Nestlé, Novo Nordisk, and Shell, the representatives on the line, David, Anne, and Duncan. Thank you so much for your time and for making yourself available to share those thoughts openly with the group this morning. Thank you, of course, also to all of the members actively shaping and diving into this Vision 2050 refresh, of which this trends work is a part. Thank you also, Julian, for all the hard work in compiling this alongside the team and alongside our Volans partners in London, so both across the Geneva and the London offices, a lot of work went into this, and we are looking forward, of course, to consolidating this in terms of an issue brief that becomes publicly available. That will happen next week. Also, what will happen is that you will receive the slides and the recording of this particular session later on, well, actually tomorrow in the course of the day, so that we consolidate both sessions into one single mailing. So slides and recording will be made available. And as you can see here, if you're interested in learning more about the ongoing work in Vision 2050, please go and visit the website that you see outlined on this particular slide. I also want to draw attention, as Julian did at the beginning of the session today, to the particular focus we will give to COVID-19 in terms of the consequences for the decade ahead, the impacts for the decades ahead. We have put for the decade, excuse me, singular, for the decade ahead. We have put down thoughts and analysis, again in collaboration with Volans and thanks to the members who have been reviewing the work and the thinking. We will be happy to share this on Wednesday, the 29th of April, at the same time, 10 a.m. CET and 4 p.m. CET. And we will also have particular members' perspectives around how they see this COVID pandemic unfolding in terms of the impacts on their business and the thoughts around the strategy implications for their particular companies and sectors. So I draw the attention to the website where you can register through the usual process, and more than happy to welcome you again on Wednesday for this particular session. With that said, and I think just in time, in terms of the timing, we're running on Swiss time, 11:26 here in Geneva. So a warm thank you to all of you who joined us today, who joined via this these virtual sessions that we have kicked off last week and will last all the way through July. We hope that they provide you with inspiration, with thoughts, with ideas on how they can shape your work and your thinking in the sustainability area. We will continue to run them, of course, twice a week on the Mondays, on the Wednesday, but all of the information, I really want to refer you to this web platform set up by our events team, where you can really find all of the information about upcoming sessions, but also past sessions, to access recording, slides, and other background documentation that you may be interested in. And of course, if you have any question or concern, feel free to reach out anytime to our events team, who will direct any question or issue to colleagues and or handle them directly. So again, thank you very much to all of you, to our speakers, to our participants, with our best wishes on behalf of the WBCSD team for good health and safety to all of you across the world, and looking forward to the next sessions and looking forward to continuing to engage with you. Thank you so much, and all the best to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.